Stanford University.
Welcome. Welcome to the 2020 Contemplation by Design Summit at Stanford. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, and it's my honor to direct Contemplation by Design. In this session, we have the wisdom and insight and knowledge of James Nestor, who has authored this book, Breath, The New Science of a Lost Art, wisely titled. James Nestor has written for Outside, the New York Times, The Atlantic, Scientific American, and more. His latest book, Breath, The New Science of a Lost Art, was released in May of this year by Riverhead Penguin Random House. Breath has been a New York Times and London Sunday Times bestseller since release and will be translated into more than 20 languages in 2021. Nestor's first book, Deep, Freediving, Renegade Science, and What the Ocean Tells Us About Ourselves, was published in 2014 and was a finalist for the PEN ESPN Award for Literary Sports Writing, an Amazon Best Science book, and more. Nestor joins us from his home where he breathes the fresh air of San Francisco. Welcome, James Nestor.
Thanks a lot for having me. It's great to be here at Stanford. Should first mention that my grandfather went to Stanford and got his MBA there. And I heard about this all while I was growing up. I was very excited to follow in his footsteps. So when I came of age, I applied to go to Stanford to follow after him. And Stanford admissions thanked me and convinced me that my intellectual prowess would be served elsewhere, specifically anywhere but Stanford. So it's great to be here, at least temporarily, at least virtually for a little while. This talk is going to have three parts. So I'm going to start off first by explaining why humans are the worst breathers in the animal kingdom and how we got there. The second part, I'm going to talk about what we can do to fix our breathing and all the benefits therein. And finally, we're going to end with a Q&A. I'm going to switch right now to a keynote presentation. One moment, everybody. This always takes a little doing, but we should be up and rolling now. So I'd like to start by explaining how me, a science journalist, got involved in writing a book about breathing, something as seemingly inconsequential as inhaling and exhaling. And I think my jumping off point was really about 8 or 9 years ago when I was sent by Outside Magazine to write about these people you're seeing here, free divers. These are people who had trained themselves to hold their breath for 7, 8, 9 minutes at a time and dive far below what any scientist thought possible. So the free divers told me that when we hold our breath and we free dive, we can become part of the underwater environment. We can do things like this. We can dive down about 200 feet and hang out with shivers of tiger sharks. Sometimes we can dive down to 100 feet and hang out with dolphins. If we're lucky enough, we can dive down and hang out with giant sperm whales. So when I asked the free divers how they were able to do what they did, they said it was easy. Anyone in reasonable health could do it. All you needed to do was learn the art of breathing. It was only by training yourself to breathe well that we could hold our breath for so long underwater. But they explained to me that this art of breathing extended beyond just free diving. We could use breathing to do all of these miraculous things. They told me about an Indian doctor who simply changed the way he inhaled and exhaled, was able to lose several pounds. They told me about another man who was injected with E. coli and breathed in a rhythmic pattern to stimulate his immune system and destroy the toxins within minutes. They also told me about an 80-year-old who used breathing to superheat his body so that he could sit in the snow for hours and hours at a time. All of this stuff, of course, sounds crazy, and it certainly sounded crazy to me. But I went out in the field, I started talking to scientists and researchers, and I learned that so much of what these freedivers had told me was actually true. Breathing was this extraordinary tool that we could use to shift our states and take control of otherwise autonomic functions. Turns out that each of us take about 30 pounds of air in and out of our bodies every single day. So far more than we eat or drink. The new science of breathing was showing us that how we took all that air in and how we exhaled it determined so much about our health, our lifespan, even human potential. Breathing was really this missing pillar of health that few people were paying attention to. The researchers told me something else, that most of us were breathing all wrong, and our poor breathing habits were having grave consequences. So I've been breathing my whole life, as have all of you, and I thought I was doing it well enough. I mean, I'm here, I'm still alive, but just breathing to get by, these researchers told me, is different than breathing to really be well, to really be healthy. It's not all about just compensating. It's about really celebrating an optimum health. And if you look at the stats around the country and really around the world, they show a pretty troubling picture. So about 9% of the US population suffers from asthma. About 16 million of us suffer from COPD, which is the third leading cause of death. About half of us snore. About 20% of us suffer from the nightly asphyxiation known as sleep apnea. Still, millions more have something called upper airway resistance syndrome. So this list goes on and on and on. And these poor breathing habits and other respiratory problems can either exacerbate or in some cases cause a laundry list of other problems like increased risk of stroke, sinusitis, acid reflux, ADHD. There were even links between poor breathing and autoimmune disorders like diabetes. So this absolutely blew me away. Had no idea anything like this existed. And the first question I had was, how have humans become so divorced from our most basic biological function? How did we evolve a trait that has become so detrimental to our health? And these scientists told me that the answers could be found in ancient skulls. So I headed back east to this place, to the Morton Collection. It's one of the largest assemblages of pre-industrial human skulls in the world. Thousands of them dating back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And the researchers working there told me that if I wanted to understand human breathing and how it's changed, I needed to look at how human teeth have changed. Because if you looked at an ancient human skull, it would have straight teeth. I know that seems crazy, but I looked at hundreds of these things. They all had straight teeth. And this researcher here, Janet Monge at the University of Pennsylvania Archaeology and Anthropology Museum, said that she had never seen a hunter-gatherer with crooked teeth, ever. So this didn't matter if this hunter-gatherer was around 500 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago. They had straight teeth. She showed me a few examples. This is one of the oldest human skulls. It's about 300,000 years old. Notice its perfectly straight teeth. Here's another skull, even older. This guy had no Invisalign, no orthodontics, no dentist, perfectly straight teeth. And notice this very powerful jaw on this forward growing profile. This is a skull of our pre-Homo sapien ancestors. It's about 1 million years old. And if this fellow had teeth, they would be straight. You notice how huge the nasal cavity is here, how forward growing and powerful the jaw is. So something interesting happens when we get to the last few hundred years. The skull you're seeing here is about 8,000 years old. Now we're going to go forward in time very quickly to a skull that's about 2,000 years old. You can notice what happens to its jaw and its mouth. Going forward even more quickly now to the last few centuries, and look what happens to the mouth. We almost look like a different species. So there's a problem with this. With a mouth that is too small for its face, teeth have nowhere to grow. So they grow in crooked instead. And we become the only species to have chronically crooked teeth. This is a very severe example. But there's another problem with this. It's when we have a mouth that's too small for our face, we can also have a smaller airway. So these researchers looked at hundreds and hundreds of ancient skulls, and almost every single skull was above that perpendicular line, meaning it had this prognathic, forward-growing face. But in the last few hundred years, our profiles have started to look more and more like this. About 90% of us are behind that perpendicular line. So this is how it affects your ability to breathe. Notice the airway here. When your face starts growing retronathically, when it grows smaller and your face grows flatter, mouth grows smaller, you have less room to breathe. This is why we become the worst breathers in the animal kingdom. So there are a few breeds of dogs, brachycephalic dogs like pugs or bulldogs, who are very bad breathers. And humans are really the human equivalent of these dogs in our ability to have so many chronic respiratory problems. So this absolutely blew me away. And I learned this about 3 or 4 years ago, and I had a hard time believing it. But these researchers just told me to look at any animal growing in the wild. So I did. Looked at chimpanzees, perfectly straight teeth, very broad airways. This handsome guy, the Berberaf macaque, perfectly straight teeth. You go into the water, marine mammals, all straight teeth. Even my little mutt of a dog, held her down, took a picture of her teeth, all straight. Meanwhile, 80 to 90% of humans have crooked teeth. So we can end up looking like this. And if we don't do anything about it, we can end up looking like this. So it turns out that having a smaller mouth makes it harder to breathe through the nose. I know this seems nuts, but it's very clear what the science shows us here. If you have a clean thumb, you can put that thumb and place it to your upper palate of your mouth. And if you feel a large indentation there, as most of us will, this is called a high arch palate or a V-shaped palate. This upward growth can inhibit airflow in the sinuses. So that upper palate doesn't descend properly when we're young. It stays high up there, which is why we have this smaller mouth. And that can actually lead us to having chronic nasal breathing problems like sinusitis, congestion, on and on. So when our noses are always stuffed up, many of us will habitually breathe through our mouths. But who cares, right? We have a mouth. Why not breathe through it? That seems perfectly logical to me. I grew up breathing through my mouth. I look at old pictures of myself and I'm breathing through my mouth often. Even in adulthood, I was breathing through my mouth, especially when I was working out. I thought this was completely normal. But I learned from dozens of researchers that mouth breathing and nasal breathing are two very different things. This man here, Dr. Christian Guilleminault, is a renowned sleep expert at the Stanford University School of Medicine who co-founded the journal Sleep and helped establish the Stanford Sleep Medicine Center. He sadly passed away last year. Guilleminault studied mouth breathing and nasal breathing for more than 40 years and found direct links between chronic mouth breathing and periodontal disease, respiratory problems, even neurological issues like ADHD. He showed very clearly that the pathway through which we breathe air could influence the way we thought, it could influence the way our bodies functioned, and it could also influence how we looked. So chronic mouth breathing, especially when we're younger, can actually affect our facial development and make it harder and harder for us to breathe later on in life. So it's so common that researchers have a name for it. They call it adenoid face. And it's associated with all of these characteristics you see here. This narrow face, this receding chin, this head forward posture. So this facial structure and posture actually make breathing more difficult and can lead, again, to several other problems like chronic headaches and lower back pain. So if you look around today, and if I look in the mirror, I see someone who looks very similar to this kid. This is really rampant throughout our population. So there are literally thousands and thousands of studies supporting Guilleminault's research. There's not a lot of controversy about how bad mouth breathing is for our health. And yet I couldn't understand why so few people outside of academia were really talking about this. So it's estimated that 25 to 50% of us habitually mouth breathe, with children and women suffering the worst. So that's just a few of hundreds of studies on this stuff. So I wanted a little more context on the difference between mouth breathing and nasal breathing. So I live in San Francisco, and luckily Stanford is pretty close to me. And I went down and found this leader in the field of nasal research. His name is Dr. Jayakar Nayak. He's the chief of rhinology research here. He's a big nose guy. And Nayak and I spent several long lunches at Vino and Oteca talking about all the wonders of the nose and nasal breathing and all the damage associated with chronic mouth breathing. But when I asked Nayak how quickly the damage of mouth breathing came on, he didn't know. So he didn't know if all the blood pressure issues, stress levels, and mental problems occurred after a few months or a few years or a few decades. So nobody knew because nobody had really tested it. And Nayak told me that to do so, in his view, would be considered unethical, knowing everything he knew about the dangers of mouth breathing. But we kept talking, and finally, I convinced him to do an informal study. And what we planned to do was to switch off the ability to breathe through the nose for 10 days. So I would just be mouth breathing. And this study, Nayak had no money for it. There was no money allocated for something as weird as this. So I ended up having to pay for it. And I was able to recruit one other person. And we would spend 10 days just breathing through our mouths and 10 days breathing through our noses as much as possible. We do tons of tests, from CAT scans to PFTs, blood work, and all that, and then compare the data sets afterwards. Here's me in Nayak's lab. He's taking a sample, a culture from the deeper recesses of my nose. If it looks like that hurt, it's because it did. Here's the other subject in the study, this guy, Anders Olsson. He's a breathing therapist from Sweden. He flew all the way from Sweden on his own dime to be a part of this. So he was very crazy to do that, but he was also very curious. He'd been talking about the benefits of nasal breathing for 10 years and really wanted to put it to the test. So here we are driving away, our first day of the mouth breathing segment of this study. Good times. Not really. I got home after about 2 hours and I took my blood pressure. And it was about 25 points higher than it had normally been. Now, blood pressure changes throughout the day. Later in the day, it can be much higher. But I've never seen my blood pressure this high. And I've been taking baseline measurements for weeks and weeks. So this is stage 2 hypertension. Very, very bad news. A couple hours after that, I went to sleep. And on the left, you can see my baseline sleeping before I became an obligate mouth breather. I snored for about 5 minutes out of the night, which was a lot for me. We had taken baselines for about 2 weeks before, and I was averaging maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes of snoring for every 8 hours. So, but the first night of mouth breathing, here's what happened. I started snoring about an hour and a half. So I would wake up and feel awful. You see how long I slept. I slept 9 hours and 31 minutes, which is a lot of time, but I kept waking up and was extremely tired. It was absolutely bizarre and pretty concerning. So this is what happened to my snoring a couple days after. It kept getting worse and worse and worse until I was snoring for about 4 hours throughout the night, 45 minutes of which were severe snoring. And this is so damaging to the brain, so damaging to the body. But my Swedish friend, Anders Olsson, the breathing therapist, this is what happened to his snoring. From snoring 0 minutes to snoring throughout the night, just constantly. We got sleep apnea, which is different from snoring. Sleep apnea is when you start choking on yourself for about 10 seconds at a time, and then you go. About a quarter of the population has sleep apnea, and as many of you are probably familiar with, it is so completely damaging to the body, causes all kinds of chronic problems. Well, I had never had sleep apnea before, but I started getting sleep apnea shortly after I was mouth breathing, and Anders was suffering even more. We wake up every morning just feeling awful, fatigued, drowsy, irritable. I don't know if you can hear that sound file here. We recorded audio files of us snoring every night. We kind of laughed about it at the beginning until we got pretty scared of what damage we were causing from our bodies. And if you hear in the background, that is my dog walking into the downstairs room here. She was concerned I was dying, and essentially I was, just very, very slowly through sleep apnea. So this shouldn't come of too much of a surprise. So there are dozens and dozens and dozens of studies that show how mouth breathing directly contributes to snoring and sleep apnea. Further, there are dozens more studies showing that when allergy season comes around, snoring and sleep apnea increase. As you all probably know, sleep apnea and snoring can contribute to hypertension, diabetes, ADHD, heart disease, increased risk of cancer, and more and more. So the good news, after that miserable 10 days, we got to spend 10 days nasal breathing as much as we possibly could. So we returned to Stanford, did our CAT scans, our PFTs, 3 rounds of blood work. It was about 8 hours, not the most fun I've ever had. But we were able to leave that night and then just breathe through our noses. And so at night, it's pretty hard to breathe through your nose, to do this unconsciously. So I would put a little piece of tape over my mouth. And I know this sounds extremely sketchy. It certainly sounded that way to me when I first heard about it. But then I talked to Ann Kearney, the doctor of speech language pathology at Stanford, and she mentioned that she used tape herself and prescribed it to her patients. I also talked to Dr. Mark Perhenny, a Palo Alto dentist and sleep specialist, who'd been prescribing this sleep tape for patients for decades and decades with really stunning results. So it felt a little awkward at first, but I stuck with it. And here's what happened. So on the very first night of switching from mouth breathing to nasal breathing, I snored for about 28 minutes. So that's quite an improvement from snoring 4 hours at my worst. And a few days later, I was snoring for about 1 minute a night out of 8 hours of sleeping. So extremely minimal. Here's where I was before on the left, and that's where I was afterwards. About 1 or 2 minutes on the worst nights, 4 minutes out of 8 hours. So basically not snoring at all. This is what happened to Anders Olsen. He was snoring like this when mouth breathing. This is what happened to his snoring by just switching the pathway through which he breathed. So minimal snoring until finally it took him a few days to recover. But after about 3 or 4 days, he wasn't snoring at all, 0 minutes. Here's what happened to my sleep apnea. I went from not too bad. My AHI was about 21 over an entire course of sleep per night, which is not medically diagnosed sleep apnea. It was getting worse and worse the longer I mouth breathed, but to none, to no drops at all. And this was interesting too. So my blood pressure while mouth breathing, within a few hours of mouth breathing, to the left and to the right is what happened the first day of nasal breathing. Nasal breathing here, about 5 days into the study, we were also doing some different breathing practices. And this was my blood pressure about a day after that nasal breathing study ended. So I don't know any medication that can drop blood pressure about 35, 40 points, but breathing did. Just breathing. We ate the exact same food at the exact same time, went to bed at the same time. We were meticulous about following the exact same schedule, approximate number of footsteps every single day. We're calculating everything, just changing our breathing. And this is what happened. So my main interest in researching breath wasn't to do self-experiments. So this informal study was just to confirm what so many other researchers had been saying for the past 50 years. And it just allowed me as a journalist to experience personally how the pathway through which we breathe air affects our health. So my point in studying all this and researching it was to find out what was broken so that we could learn to fix it. And that's exactly what I did over the course of several years. I spent more time at Stanford, went to other laboratories and archaeological burial sites. I went to doctors' offices, psychologist offices, medical libraries, on and on and on, in an attempt to learn not only how improper breathing has hurt us, but how breathing correctly can heal the body, make us healthier, make us happier, and allow us to live longer lives. The good news is it turns out a lot of the damage that's been done to us can actually be reversed by adopting healthy breathing habits. So what I'm going to enter into now in the phase 2 of this talk is what you can do, what I learned that basically anyone can do to improve their breathing and have a direct influence on their health. The first thing you need to do is breathe through your nose. So Dr. Jayakar Nayak told me, if a sink is plugged in your house, you're going to find a way of unplugging it as soon as possible. So the nose has to be considered the exact same thing. If your nose is plugged, find a way of clearing it. Some people need surgical interventions. Other people can use neti pots. Nayak uses a low-dose steroid with a neti pot, which works for a lot of people. Some people can use sprays, and that works too. Or you can just start breathing through your nose more. The more you use your nose, the more you will be able to use your nose. It is really a use it or lose it organ. So the nose is not this random appendage. It serves innumerable functions. So every time we breathe through the nose, we are moistening air, we're filtering it, we're heating it, we're pressurizing it. And all of this conditions that air so that by the time it enters the lungs, it is treated and our lungs can more easily absorb oxygen that way. So our nose is our first line of defense. Here's another look at this incredible thing. So it takes up about all the sinuses and the nose and other structures take up about the volume of a billiard ball. So you can imagine a billiard ball and shoving that in the middle of your face. That contains all of the structures of the nose. So the sinuses are covered in mucus, as many of you probably know. What you may not know is that this mucus is constantly on the move. It's sweeping along at a rate of about ½ an inch every minute. That's about 60 feet per day. So this works like this giant conveyor belt. It collects inhaled debris and it moves all that junk down into the throat and into the stomach where it is sterilized by stomach acid and delivered out of the body. What helps the mucus move along are these things, millions of these tiny little hair-like structures called cilia. They move like a field of wheat in the wind, swaying each time we inhale and exhale at about 16 beats per second. And these movements allow that mucus to keep moving, to constantly move down us and through us, sterilize all that gunk that enters into our noses. So here's a view of what the sinuses look like. This is an extremely intricate structure. It's so similar to a seashell. If you were to cut a human head in half, and I've seen my head cut in half in a CAT scan, you would see something that looked a lot like a seashell, which is why the nasal cavities and sinuses get the name of nasal concha after the conch shell. So that's the first rule. And something that I learned firsthand, breathe through the nose as often as you possibly can. The second rule is to breathe slow and to breathe steady. So about 20 years ago, Italian researchers began studying the Ave Maria. That's the prayer cycle in the rosary. And they began comparing it to the Buddhist mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. And they noticed that both of these prayers required the same amount of breaths per minute. To recite one of the prayers, it takes about 5 to 6 seconds. And while you're reciting that prayer, you are, of course, exhaling. And then there's about 5 to 6 seconds to inhale. So these researchers, being scientists, gathered a group of subjects and they covered them with sensors and they recorded what happened to their bodies and brains when they recited these two different prayers. And they noticed that their heart rate lowered, their baroreceptor sensitivity increased significantly, more oxygen was delivered to the brain. So these are some of the findings that they found. So what was most fascinating to me is that when you're reciting these prayers, the systems of the body entered a state of coherence, where everything was working at peak efficiency. So the researchers wrote that the rhythm necessarily imposed by these repetitions induces a fixed respiratory rate at a predetermined frequency. In times when stopwatches and metronomes had still not been invented, a rhythmic formula was the easiest way to keep a reasonably accurate timing in the range of several seconds per breath, and thus a good way to learn to slow respiration to a given rate. So that's pretty wordy, but what they were saying is prayers were a way of inducing slow breathing in people. And they even went to so far as to suggest that there's one of the reasons why prayer might be so healing to people is that it caused them to slow down and breathe at this restorative rate. And they found this respiratory rate not just in Catholic prayers or in that Buddhist mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, but they found it in other prayers, Sata Nama, which is a Kundalini chant, or Om. Each of those works out to about 5 to 6 breaths per minute, 5 to 6 seconds inhale, 5 to 6 seconds exhale. But the best news here is that you don't need to pray to get these benefits. All you need to do is slow down your breathing. And you can influence your coherence in your body from looking something like this, very disorganized, to looking something like this, where things are able to function again at peak efficiency. So for the past 2 decades, hundreds of therapists, including Dr. Richard Brown here at Columbia, have used this slow-paced breathing to treat patients with anxiety, with depression, even 9/11 survivors who suffered from this ghastly thing called ground glass lungs. So nothing worked for these people with ground glass lungs. No pharma treatments, no natural herbal treatments, but breathing did and worked better than anything else. It's so simple, it seems so intuitive, yet it's so powerful at balancing the body, which is exactly what we need to do throughout the day. You can try it here. You can breathe along with this animation. So a couple of years ago, researchers at Northwestern University found that breathing in this rhythmic pattern, always through the nose again, can coordinate electrical activity across a network of brain regions associated with smell, associated with memory and emotions, specifically the piriform cortex, the hypothalamus, and the amygdala. So the slow and rhythmic breathing pattern organized the activity of populations of cells within these brain regions to help orchestrate complex behaviors. That was their quote, not mine. In other words, it allowed us to think more clearly just by breathing at this slow and easy pace. So the next thing, and I realize this seems kind of random, but give me a chance here to explain. If you want to improve your breathing, you need to chew more. So there's a reason why all of our ancestors, dating back millions of years, all had straight teeth and these very powerful forward-growing jaws and vast sinuses. It's because they chewed a lot. Our ancestors chewed up to 4 hours a day, every day. And this intensive chewing helped them grow more bone and musculature in their faces, which resulted in broader mouths and more open airways. But then something curious happened around 300 or so years ago. All of these industrialized, highly processed foods began flooding into the food supply. So advances in milling removed the German bran from rice, leaving only the starchy white seed. Other advances in roller mills and later steam mills ripped the German bran from wheat, leaving only soft white flours. We started canning vegetables, canning meats, bottling stuff. All of this stuff extended the shelf life of foods, but it also made them very mushy and very soft. And sugar, which was once a prized commodity of the wealthy, became increasingly common and cheap. So for the first time in history, humans could spend their entire lives eating nothing but processed food. Nothing fresh, nothing raw, nothing natural. Millions did. The less they chewed, the smaller their mouths grew, the more crooked their teeth became. So researchers have known about this for more than 100 years. Sim Wallace wrote about this extensively in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And many of his researchers and the people that he taught went on to measure ancient skulls and found that indeed they had these very large mouths. They had these very straight teeth. And they explained that there was really no controversy about this. Everyone knew it. It was very clear. The science was very clear. And yet no one really listened to Sim Wallace or any of his fellow researchers. Instead, for the next 100 years, food just got more and more processed, softer and softer and softer. And if you think about the modern American diet, I mean, not only is it nutritionally deficient, but it's almost all soft. So cheese sauces, baked stuff, spaghetti, fried roots, all of this stuff is soft. Even when you consider what is healthy food today, we drink smoothies, we sip Go-Gurt, we eat oatmeal, we eat avocados. All of this stuff is soft. We hardly chew at all. So I look for some sort of clarification on this issue because this completely blew my mind that the science was so clear, and yet again, no one was really talking about it. So I logged on to the National Institutes of Health website. What I found there was even more confusing. The NIH listed the causes of crooked teeth as most often to hereditary. So that was their quote. And by that, they couldn't explain how our ancestors' teeth were so perfect and our teeth were almost all crooked. How did that happen? Other causes of crooked teeth, they said, were caused by thumb sucking or injury or, quote, tumors of the mouth and jaw. So there was no mention of chewing. There's no mention of food at all on the NIH website. And yet dozens of biological anthropologists, orthodontists, rhinologists, and more were telling me all the same thing. They were showing me all the same thing too, that our crooked teeth were a modern problem and they were caused by soft and processed foods. So after several months of researching this and still being completely flustered, this book came out. It was written by famed biologist and Stanford professor, Dr. Paul Ehrlich, and orthodontist Sandra Kahn. So Ehrlich and Kahn, too, had been frustrated by the lack of attention to the subject and spent years putting together a definitive scientific guide with hundreds of references, confirming everything that I was hearing as to why our teeth and breathing today are so messed up and how the lack of chewing has been such a large part of this. So not only does chewing help form a proper mouth, to form a face, to form skeleture, to form proper musculature, it also serves so many other functions. Chewing helps drain fluid in our ear canals. It helps drain sinuses. It increases blood flow to the brain. And chewing can actually help us breathe better. So if you consider the oral pharynx and the throat and the tongue and all the other structures in the airway, what we've got here is essentially a collection of muscles. And these muscles respond to input the way any other muscle does. So the less they are used, the flabbier and more out of shape they can get. This can lead to airway resistance and all the associated problems that come with it. So we can exercise these muscles and tone them. And when we do, we can help open our airways and breathe better. So again, this is something that so few people seem to be talking about. And basically none of the snorers or people with sleep apnea that I talked to knew anything about it. It was that you could work out the muscles in the throat and breathe better. And here are just a few of a dozen different studies that have shown that by doing these exercises with the tongue, with the pharynx, with the throat, you can reduce mild to even moderate snoring and sleep apnea. It has a, quote, significant effect. And it's curious to note that all of these exercises that we've now developed really do nothing more than to train our mouths and throats to do what happens when we chew. They're the same movements of chewing. So you could chew a bunch of hard food, that's one way of doing it, or you could do these exercises. Either work. So it's inspiring to me to learn that you can still show marked improvement to your airway health in adulthood. A lot of this is very important in infancy and in early childhood, but even in adulthood, we can make some marked, measured improvements to our breathing. And I was curious to see what I could do for my very poor breathing. I spent years working out a lot, eating the right foods, sleeping plenty, and yet I was getting constant respiratory problems. And it got so bad that my doctor, I was getting pneumonia year in and year out. She suggested I take a breathing class, which was another real catalyst to exploring this world of breath that I've been doing for the past few years. But she told me that by adopting different chewing habits, that adopting different breathing habits, by adopting different oral postures, you can actually influence your airway health, just as I had mentioned. So I did this for a year. I wore a device that stimulated chewing stress, and I chewed on this really awful tasting Turkish gum that was rock hard called Falim. Did this for a year and took a CAT scan before and after, and these results were analyzed through the Mayo Clinic. So on the left is my airway before, on the right is my airway after. So big improvement. Here's another view. On the left, my airway before, right, airway after, yet another view, and this is interesting also. So on the left, you can see my sinuses. There's pus and granulation in there that had been developing, likely due to airway resistance, likely due to upper airway resistance syndrome. But after chewing and after adopting healthy oral posture and healthy breathing habits, you can see all that pus and granulation is gone to the right. So on the left, before, right, after. It's inspiring to me that we can make so many of these positive changes to our bodies just by paying attention to our breathing and by chewing. So next, breathe less. So few of us would argue that we become a culture of overeaters. If you look at the BMI for Americans from 1850 to 1960, it was about 20 to 22. So that equals about 160 pounds for a 6 foot tall person. So today, the average BMI is about 29, a 38% jump in 50 years. That 6 foot tall person now weighs about 214 pounds. So 70% of the US population is considered overweight. 1 in 3 are obese. So there's no doubt we're eating more than we did in the past. We're eating worse foods. But something researchers mentioned to me was that we've likely become a culture of over-breathers as well. They said that this is rampant. So much of the population is breathing much more than they need to. We've been conditioned to breathe too much, just as we've been conditioned to eat too much. So when we breathe over our metabolic needs, we create a lot of undue wear and tear on our bodies. So we can spike our heart rates, we can increase blood pressure, we can release stress hormones into our bodies. It's all bad news. And surprisingly, as counterintuitive as this seems, the harder we breathe, the more we breathe over our metabolic needs, the harder it is for us to offload oxygen. So you can, I'll show you a little example of this right now. Take about 10 to 20 big breaths through the mouth or nose for this exercise, it doesn't matter. So you're gonna probably feel some tingling in your fingers, a little lightness in your head. That's not from an increase of oxygen to those areas, but a decrease of circulation. That's what happens when we overbreathe. Patrick McEwen, a well-known breathing therapist, shared this chart with me. And you can see how inefficient breathing 20 times a minute, which is just above what is considered normal is, compared to breathing about 6 times a minute. Same volume of air, just breathing more slowly. Because a lot of that gas exchange happens at the bottom of our lungs, because that's where most of the blood is. So by breathing slowly and more deeply, we're breathing more efficiently, which again is exactly what our bodies want to do. So populations of asthmatics and panic sufferers are some of the populations that breathe the worst, and they're some of the populations that overbreathe the worst too. What happens is they become so conditioned to associate this inability to breathe with a panic attack that they become conditioned to breathe more and more in an attempt to avoid that attack. But what they do is they start breathing, and again, these populations of panic sufferers, asthmatics, traditionally tend to be more mouth breathers than the rest of the population. They'll start breathing, feel they're losing their breath, breathe more and more and more, which just exacerbates an attack. So oral steroids and bronchodilators are extremely effective in keeping asthma symptoms at bay. They're real lifesavers. But these drugs do nothing for the core cause of asthma. And after extended use, they can make asthma much worse. And they also have several serious side effects, leading to chronic hypertension, weight gain, autoimmune diseases, depression, and on and on. So this guy, a Russian cardiologist by the name of Konstantin Buteyko, thought that overbreathing was directly causing asthma. It was directly causing some forms of hypertension. So for 50 years, he taught people how to breathe less, to control their breathing. To be clear, he wasn't teaching them to breathe below their metabolic needs. He was teaching them to breathe normally, which for many of these people, for most of these people, was to breathe significantly less than they were used to. So a very similar method called the Papworth method was developed in a British hospital in the 1960s and had similar benefits. So this was the most convincing research I found. This was by Dr. Alicia Muret. She completed doctoral studies at Stanford, then went on to Harvard to complete her postdoctoral studies. She now works at Southern Methodist University. So in 2007, she took a group of panic sufferers and taught them just how to breathe less, no drugs, just simply to breathe within their metabolic needs. And she used a capnometer to gauge how in line they were breathing with those metabolic needs. So when you overbreathe, you can off-gas too much CO2. You want to keep your CO2 at a healthy level. And that capnometer allowed these people to do this. And you can see the results here were just incredible. These people stopped, so many of them stopped suffering from panic. And even a year after, 96% reported being either much improved or very much improved, simply by breathing. Muret went on to use this same therapy with 120 asthmatics, simply training them to breathe less. And you can see how these people benefit. Again, not very subtle. I'm happy to share these studies with anyone. They're freely available online as well. So the last step here that I want to get into, and this gets out into some human potential stuff that I wanted to quickly gloss over, is breathing awareness. We may not be able to take conscious control of our livers, of our kidneys, our hearts, or our stomachs, but when we control our breathing, we can influence all these organs and so much more. We can change how our blood circulates. We can change how our heart beats. We can even take control of aspects of our immune function. I know this sounds crazy, but I spent years researching this stuff with experts in the field who showed me exactly how powerful breathing was to help heal our bodies, and even in some cases, to help heat our bodies in freezing temperatures. This guy, Carl Stow, was a choral conductor in New Jersey. He developed this breathing technique to help singers gain more nuance and volume in their voices. He became so famous that he went on to train opera singers who were already pretty good at breathing at the Met Opera to breathe even better. So the largest VA hospitals on the East Coast got wind of Stau's work, invited him to come in and help these poor people, these emphysemics. So that is Stau right now. We don't have time to go into his little speech there, but this is a pretty incredible story here with Carl Stau. He was invited by the pulmonary staff at East Orange Hospital, various VA hospitals, to work on these emphysemics. And basically, no one knew what to do with these patients. They would wheel them in and place them on these gurneys and hook up an oxygen tube to them and basically leave them there. Some of the nurses had put pillows underneath their back thinking that that was helping them. And Stau found that was about the worst thing they could do for these people. So they had no ability to breathe. They had about 10% diaphragmatic movement. And so every breath was a struggle. So I'm going to show you what their diaphragms look like. He started taking x-rays. This is an x-ray film of the diaphragmatic movement of an emphysemic. So that's the diaphragm down below. It's hardly moving at all. This is what it's supposed to look like. This very fluid movement. It goes up when we exhale, it goes down when we inhale. So here's another example. This is one of Stau's patients. This is him breathing. That is his neck. So what happens when you're not engaging your diaphragm, you have to use these other muscles to just take a breath. And it's called respiratory fault. You're using these accessory muscles, and that is his rib cage. So this is the patient a few weeks after being trained just how to engage that diaphragm now to breathe slowly and more deeply. So he looks transformed here. He's able to walk again. He was hardly able to walk before. This guy ended up walking out of the hospital, living a healthy life. Here he is before. This is after several weeks of breath retraining. That's the same person. So completely transformed. Stau went on for 10 years. He spent in the VA hospitals rehabilitating thousands and thousands of patients. He then ended up going to the Olympic track team in Lake Tahoe as they prepared for the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, taught them how to breathe properly. He said that even these runners were breathing improperly. They went down and destroyed everyone. I think it's still the greatest Olympic performance by any track team in history. And they claim that they were able to do that by breathing properly through Stau's training. They were the only team not to use oxygen before and after events. They said they didn't need to because they had their lungs, because they had proper breathing. What was very sad to me was to learn that when Stau left the VA hospitals, all of his therapy disappeared. So it's been very interesting to me. My book's been out for about 3 months. I've been contacted by some of these people who claim that their lives were absolutely saved by Stau, by learning how to breathe. That's been pretty incredible. These people are still around. They're in their 80s. Some of them are in their 90s. They were basically at death's door, and they're still living, they're still breathing. So here's another something that I thought was pretty interesting, is to learn how we can use breathing to not only heal our bodies, but to heat our bodies as well. So this woman here, Alexandra David Neal, she spent 14 years in the Himalayas in the early 1900s. And she learned this ancient practice called Tumo. She wrote about it in a book called My Journey to Lhasa. And she claimed that all of the mountain people use this breathing technique to not only heal themselves if they got sick, but to heat themselves. She said that these monks would sit in the snow for hours at a time overnight and melt a circle around themselves, which of course is impossible. That sounds crazy. And I don't think too many people believed her. But people traveled to India and Nepal in the 60s and came back reporting the exact same thing over and over, that these monks were able to sit in the snow for hours with only a thin sheet around them and heat themselves through breathing. So finally, Herbert Benson at the Harvard Medical School had heard enough of these stories, and he thought, let's put these people to the test. He flew out to Dharamsala in India, got some of these monks, hooked them up to all kinds of sensors, and found that yes, they were able to superheat their bodies with breathing. They were able to increase the temperature in their extremities by 17 degrees. They were able to sit in a cold room where the temperature was in the 50s and to dry a wet sheet on their bodies just by breathing. Just produce steam and the sheet would be dry. The videos of this are available. The study was published in Nature. So still, people thought this was pretty crazy. Oh, these crazy monks, who knows what sort of special tricks they had learned up there in the Himalayas. Until this guy came around, Wim Hof. He's a Dutch man. And for about 20 years, he's been doing these outrageous stunts that have really been rewriting medical textbooks. He's a modern version of these Tumo monks. Here he is sitting in ice for just about 2 hours. So he suffered from no frostbite and no hypothermia. He was able to breathe in ways that directly tapped into his autonomic nervous system. So again, this was supposed to have been medically impossible, but here he is doing it. I've talked to Wim several times, and he's able to show basically anyone in reasonable health how to do the same thing. So he repeated these stunts in labs that confirmed it. Then people were saying, oh, Wim, he's just this crazy guy. He's this freak of nature. No one can do this stuff. So they set up a randomized controlled trial where they got a group of people and they split them in half, one control group. The other half spent 4 days training with Wim. They brought both groups together in a lab and they shot them up with E. coli to see what would happen. So normally, being shot up with E. coli would induce extreme flu-like symptoms, shaking, headaches, sweats, just awfulness. So none of Wim's students suffered from any of these symptoms. So the control group suffered from violent symptoms and they were totally miserable. And this was confirmed in this study. They later found out that breathing in this certain way and being exposed to cold on occasion would allow anti-inflammatory markers to rise up about 200%, while pro-inflammatory mediators would lower about 50%. So this was especially effective for people who not only wanted to heat themselves, but wanted to overcome autoimmune issues. So, and even these researchers said that conditions associated with excessive or persistent inflammation, especially autoimmune diseases, could really benefit from this. And I've talked to several people, and I've read the stories from dozens and dozens and dozens of people who have overcome things like psoriasis, eczema, even some symptoms of type 1 diabetes, many other autoimmune issues just by breathing in certain ways and exposing themselves to cold. Right now, Alyssa Eppel, I'm sure many of you have heard of her at the University of California, San Francisco, is now doing another study with people with autoimmune issues and breathing in cold exposure. So it turns out that no, the autonomic nervous system is not autonomic as in automatic. We can directly hack into it. We can hack into our immune function, and we can do this by breathing. So the ancients, of course, have known all about this stuff. They've been writing about it and practicing it for thousands and thousands of years. The ancient Chinese wrote 7 books entirely focused on breathing. All the bad things that would happen to us if we did it incorrectly, specifically if we inhaled through our mouths, and all the healthy and wonderful things that could happen to us if we did it properly, if we practice healthy breathing habits. The Chinese called their system of conscious breathing Qigong, Qi meaning breath, and Gong meaning work, or put together, breath work. So various cultures have known about this, again, for centuries and centuries. And I think that we are just now really starting to learn about the true benefits of healthy breathing. You can go on PubMed and you can see hundreds and hundreds of studies, several of which have been done just in the past year, showing the clear, measurable benefits of adopting healthy breathing habits. There's currently a huge breathing study going on right now at Stanford by Dr. Andrew Huberman at the Huberman Lab. And Yale is working on various breathing studies, as is Harvard. So this stuff really seems to be being accepted as a serious pursuit by academia. And it's pretty thrilling. So it seems that like modern science is just further proving what these ancients have known for such a long time, that when we understand, appreciate, and practice healthy breathing habits, we can help use our natural bodies to reduce the symptoms and in some extraordinary cases, heal ourselves of so many chronic modern maladies. So thank you very much for listening. We're gonna flip now to some Q&A.
James, thank you for that brilliantly prepared summary of the scientific literature and the anthropological viewpoint. It was just a real journey through the story of breath and the human story. In terms of our questions, we have categories that have arisen. So I'm going to, rather than read each question, sort of put some themes together. Beginning with the very concrete reference to oral posture. And people, you notice, you use the phrase healthy oral posture. And we've had several requests for having that spelled out specifically, if you're comfortable doing that.
Of course.
Thank you.
So this is a really burgeoning field of research. It's being actively researched by many orthodontists and many other people in that field. So this is improper oral posture. I'll start with the bad, then we'll get to the good.
Thank you.
This right here, I don't know if you can see that. Jaw loose, mouth slightly open, tongue down. This is not the way we should be holding our mouths. It's not the way we should be breathing. So by correct oral posture, what you want to do is lightly have the teeth touching, tongue on the roof of the mouth. When you open your mouth just a little bit, you can feel the tongue rocking back into the airway. That's because that's what it does. This makes breathing harder. So simply by closing the mouth, by letting the tongue rise up to the upper palate, that airway is going to open. This is something that's been studied extensively by Dr. Stephen Park at Albert Einstein Medical School. And he has x-rays of it too, which are pretty mind-blowing. So that's how we should be holding our faces throughout all of the day, as much as we possibly can. And at night, we do not want to be sleeping like this, which is something I did for about 30 years, thinking it was normal to wake up every single night with an extremely dry mouth and have a huge glass of water by the bedside. That is not normal. We should definitely be sleeping with our mouths shut by breathing through our nose, as I hope I made clear that the benefits of nasal breathing.
And in the spirit of that point, people have asked for more reference or even the name of the tape that you mentioned could be put on the mouth. What kind of tape is that? And tell us more.
So thank goodness for American entrepreneurialism. There are now various different tapes that you can buy on Amazon. Somnifix is one of them, a pretty popular tape. It's a special tape for your mouth. You can use that stuff if you want. That's great. I've found that a $3 roll of micropore hypoallergenic surgical tape. So this has a very easy adhesive. It has no funky smell. This, I learned about this from Ann Kearney, the doctor of speech language pathology at Stanford. This is the stuff she used. And so what I do is, you're going to go on YouTube and you're going to see a bunch of garbage. So don't look up sleep tape on YouTube. You're going to see people with 9 different strips on their mouth. You don't need any of that. And you don't need to place a piece of tape across your entire mouth. So all I've found you need, and you know, this comes down to personal preference too. You get a piece of tape about the size of a postage stamp. I take off some of this adhesive here and I place it. This is going to be very silly, but I place it right here, the middle of my mouth. I can still cough. I can still talk. When I talk this way, drives my wife crazy, but that's what it is. So the point of this is not to create a hermetic seal for the mouth. That's going to make you paranoid and anxious. It's just to gently train your mouth shut when you are unconscious, when you are sleeping. And I can't tell you, you know, dozens and dozens of people have written with mild and moderate sleep apnea and snoring who have said they've recorded their sleep before and after doing this. And they said they no longer snore, and some of them no longer have sleep apnea. And the best part about this, it's basically free. This roll is going to last me about 3 months, and it costs $3, so about $1 a month. And there's no side effects. If anything, it's going to train you to breathe through your nose more, which is actually going to increase oxygenation. It's going to increase nitric oxide, all of these other benefits that I didn't get into. So that is sleep tape. And if you have any big problems with that, you can just walk over to Dr. Ann Kearney and talk to her about it. And she's got a bunch of more literature on it.
People are so inspired. Just state again the name of the tape.
Okay, this is, and again, you can use any kind of tape, maybe not duct tape, but this is 3M micropore tape. And that's the stuff. It's called NextCare Sensitive Skin 3M micropore tape. That's a real mouthful right there.
Okay.
You can buy it. It was sold out on Amazon for the last couple months. I think people are getting hip to it, but I think they have more of it now. But other kinds of tape work. You can go down to your local drugstore and again, there's stuff on Amazon that's specifically for this, Somnifix. There's other kinds of tape specifically for snoring that you can use as well. I should mention something while you've got me on this soapbox, that for kids, sleeping with a closed mouth is so important, because this is when the face and airways are developing. And if you have this posture all the time, your face is actually going to grow different, and it's going to get harder to breathe later on in life. And this is very clear. The science is clear on this. But a lot of parents, rightfully so, feel a little freaked out about putting a little piece of tape on their kid's mouth. Even if it comes right off, you can just open your mouth. So Patrick McEwen developed this stuff. And what this does is it goes around the mouth. This is for kids, so it's not going to fit around my mouth, especially I have a beard, it's really not going to work. But it gently trains the mouth shut, but it also allows them to open their mouth at any time. So he's used sleep tape for 20 years. It's worked great. He's never had one problem. But for people who want to try something else for kids, I've heard this works great. So that isn't any endorsement. I'm just offering different versions of this.
And now moving down the anatomy to the diaphragm, you showed the inspiring footage of Stowe's work with the people with emphysema. Can you speak a little more about the retraining and the actual anatomical steps that help their diaphragms to start working?
Sure. So a lot of us who sit in chairs all day in front of computers, which is, I guess, the entire US population nowadays, we tend to sit like this, kind of leaned over like this. Even when we're eating, we're looking at our phones, our necks out. So it's really hard to engage proper diaphragmatic movement when we're doing that, because the diaphragm is mostly adhered to our backs, not the front. It's this huge cape of muscle that looks like a parachute that lifts up when we exhale and sinks back down when we inhale. So the first thing to do is to start breathing more slowly through the nose. When you breathe through the nose, you're going to be breathing deeper breaths. And you want to engage that diaphragm more. Don't look at this as some sort of competition. People hear this and they start really pushing it. Be very gentle with your breathing, especially if you've been breathing a certain way for so long. What you want to regain is some flexibility in your rib cage and the respiratory muscles here. A lot of us lose this, especially when we grow older. We start losing lung capacity, about 15% from the time we're 30 to 50, and then much more after that. So guess what yoga does? You stretch, breathing into this lung, stretch, breathing into this lung. It keeps this flexible so that we can maintain that proper diaphragmatic movement. So to answer your question very simply, it's to breathe slowly, it's to breathe gently, and it's to breathe deeply. And engaging more diaphragmatic, I won't go too into this, but not only will that allow you to upload more oxygen more efficiently, but the diaphragm actually plays a role in pumping lymph fluid out of our bodies. I just talked to a doctor about this. I'll include it in the next edition of the book. But by the diaphragm sinking down, we gently massage the other organs in our body, which helps leach out lymph fluid and pump it out, which this is something I just heard about. I'm fascinated by, but the science is pretty clear about that. And when you're only breathing up here, you're getting none of those benefits.
And thank you for that reference to yoga and the tradition of training the breath that yoga provides, which you referenced in your talk when you said the ancient. We'll just mention it as from the yoga tradition of pranayama. And we had several questions asking you to speak to the breath of fire and alternate nostril breathing. To what extent you'd like to add on to what you've already said, I'll give you a moment.
So the thing that frustrated me a little bit when I was first researching this book is reading books on breathing, especially yoga books, and there's 500 different breathing techniques and they all have these names you can't pronounce. So I don't get into specific breathing techniques in the book. What I did is so many of these things are doing the same thing. There's yoga techniques to hold your breath. There's yoga techniques to breathe less, and there's yoga techniques to breathe more on occasion. Not all the time, but to force yourself to. That's what Tumo is. That's how you can heat up your body. So there are a zillion different names for these. They're the same practices in ancient Chinese breathwork. They're the same practices in Indian breathwork. Different names, same stuff. But if you're looking at alternate nostril breathing, this is something that's been around for what, 1,500 years? And it turns out that our natural bodies are already doing alternate nostril breathing because our nostrils are coated in erectile tissue, which works the same way as erectile tissue, you know where, elsewhere in our bodies. So throughout the day, one nostril is going to gently open as the other gently closes. After about 30 minutes to 3 to 4 hours, the other is going to open as the other gently closes. So our bodies are naturally doing this. We can hack this by breathing in different ways. And we know that has a significant and measurable effect on our bodies. Breathing through the left nostril will calm the body. It will reduce heart rate. It will reduce stress. Inhaling through the right will increase heart rate. It will increase blood pressure. It will bring heat into the body. What's been interesting is there's dozens and dozens of studies showing this, and it's measurable. Even EEG studies showing what happens to the brain by just inhaling and exhaling through different sides of the nose.
Thank you. In terms of the reference you gave us to chewing, could you speak to what is known about how far into one's adulthood adding more chewing can contribute to an enhancement of the structure of the face and the muscles related to breath?
It's a great question. I wish somebody would study this with a real randomized controlled trial. There have been no studies on this, but what's interesting is there have been several studies looking at these oral pharyngeal exercise training. So this is as close as we're going to get. I don't know if we can take two groups of people, have them eat really hard food and really, I'd be fascinated. You guys are at Stanford. You guys should do it. But these oral pharyngeal exercises, as I mentioned in the talk, are basically doing the same thing that proper chewing is doing. So when you chew, you usually chew on one side or the other. You're not chewing on both sides of your jaw, because when you do that, what happens when you're angry or you're about to fight? You clench both sides down. That's a sympathetic response. So chewing and digesting is a parasympathetic response. So if you think about chewing a carrot, it's one side or the other, and that's where we get the most benefits. So this idea that people can just put something in their mouth and gnaw on it on both sides, it's much better to chew hard foods, but that's a little off subject here. So the closest thing analog we've gotten to a chewing study are those studies I just showed. I'm happy to share all of the links for those. But what they do is they have people put the tongue on the roof of their mouth and suck the tongue upwards, just like that, which is exactly what you do once you've chewed and you swallow. When you're swallowing properly, what do? You put the tongue on the roof of your mouth and you go like that. So There's several other exercises. I won't go into them. These were published in Chest, a very respected journal. It's all real stuff. But as I mentioned in the talk, it's confounding to me that these exercises are free. They're available to everyone. They can show that they have a significant benefit for people with snoring or sleep apnea, basically anybody. And yet no one is talking about this in sleep medicine. And I wish they would. And hopefully the awareness is increasing now.
And in that vein of hope, do you know if the National Institutes of Health are compiling a library of free videos or instructions as they did with respect to topics such as exercise?
You can go on PubMed and you can research healthy breathing, yogic breathing, alternate nostril breathing. I mean, I spent years and years on PubMed, and that's how I found a lot of these researchers. That's how I found Dr. Jayakar Nayak, the chief of rhinology research. So I don't see too much movement in the NIH, especially in regards when they're still saying crooked teeth are directly caused or inherited, but they're not acknowledging any role of chewing or food at all. I'm don't have too much faith in them, although I love PubMed is such an amazing resource. Thousands and thousands of studies on breathing there. So I know that some of these people watching might end up working at the NIH, and that's inspiring to me because I think there's a lot of work that should be done, that could be done on free things, entirely free things that people can do that have a real measurable effect on their health.
Well, I thank you for the book that you have offered to help people know all of this information. Well, another theme in the questions has been the fact that, as we are aware, and as this summit on contemplative practices is in companion with, that there has been a growing appreciation for meditation and contemplation and mindfulness. And yet I can also bear witness to the fact that often people are invited to meditate, but they're not taught how to breathe or anything about postural alignment. Can you speak to what you've seen and what you would suggest about the marriage of breath knowledge with mindfulness?
There's no doubt that meditation has so many benefits, but most of those benefits, this is my belief and the belief of many of the researchers I talk to, start happening much later once you're a much more developed meditator, once you're a better meditator. Those initial benefits from meditation come from breathing properly. So what's the first thing that almost every meditation is going to have you do? I'd like you to slow down and focus on your breath. And it doesn't matter what school of meditation you're going to, it is slowing that respiration rate, which is why I thought it was so interesting that you can look at all of these different prayers that have this very slow, very rhythmic respiration rate. So I think it would be interesting to do a study where you take two groups of people. You have one of them breathe at a certain rhythmic rate and not think of anything. They can look at their iPhones, they can look at Instagram, whatever. Have the other meditate, and then see what happens after a month. See if one group has more benefits from the other. And I want to be totally clear now. Once you've established a regular meditation practice, there's so many benefits to it. We know that. But initially, my belief is those initial benefits are from the way in which you're breathing. And I spent a long time with Dr. Justin Feinstein at the Laureate Institute of Brain Research. And he found for his patients with PTSD, for anxiety, for panic, these people cannot sit in a dark room and stare at a wall, but they can breathe. So he could, in the way that he was able to relax them is say, you can look at a magazine, read a book, watch TV, but you're going to be breathing at this rate. You're going to be getting your CO2 levels up to a healthy balance. And that alone has really significant effects.
Thank you for highlighting that continuum and the distinction between establishing healthy breath and then entering into different meditative states. We have another category of questions, and that's around children and how to support children. You had the image of the child asleep, it appeared, with her mouth open, and just how you would take all this knowledge and insight and bring it into a direct relationship you want the participant might have with their own child, or if they're a teacher of young children, how they might begin to address it in the classroom and incorporate this knowledge of breath.
I think the first thing you have to do with kids, especially infants, is look at their breathing. And this is something so few people are doing. They see kids with the same issues, sleeplessness, ADHD, a bunch of other, sometimes autoimmune problems, stomach problems. They change their diet, but no one's looking at their breathing, and they're not looking at their breathing at night. And we know that sleep apnea, which is becoming so common for kids right now, can cause so much neurological damage. I mean, growth problems. It inhibits growth because when you have all that cortisol in your body, osteoblasts can't do what they're designed to do. So, and that's very clear. The science is very, very clear on that. So when you have an infant, and if you hear any resistance in breathing, it doesn't have to be official sleep apnea. It doesn't have to be snoring. And Christian Guillemot studied this stuff for 30 years, and all of his research was focused, not all of it, the majority was focused on kids. So any resistance in the breathing is a problem. And that's the first thing that should be looked at. I know that there are surgical interventions. There's what's becoming increasingly common now is for kids, even before they're at age 2, orthodontists are starting to look at these kids and looking at their airway development, because whatever they have at 2, everything's going to be modeling around that. So to have proper airway development at an early age, you're going to have a proper airway and you're going to be able to breathe easier later on in life. So what they're doing now, instead of, and this is, I didn't get into this in my talk, but the very first orthodontics weren't taking out teeth or using braces or using headgear. They were expanding the mouth, and they were designed to open the airway. And the straight teeth just came as a side effect from that. Because when you have a wider mouth, you have a bigger mouth, you have more room for teeth to grow in straight. All of that is coming back now. And orthodontics right now is going through this huge sea change where they are starting once again to expand mouths, to open airways, and to also give their patients straight teeth.
Thank you for that clarification about what options exist. We have a specific question where someone noted the gum you chewed for a year and wanted to know what that gum was and where does one get it?
I could go out. It's in the other room now, but I won't get up. It's the hardest gum I could find. It's called Phyleme. It's been out of stock now for a little while too, which they must be wondering what the heck is going on here in the States. But it's called Phyleme. It is sugar-free, mint flavored, and it does not taste pleasant, people, but it gives you a very significant jaw workout. And I want to be very clear that for people without TMJ problems, chewing is very beneficial for all the reasons I mentioned. Drains sinuses, drains the eustachian tubes, increases oxygenation to the brain, on and on and on. But if you have ongoing TMJ problems, chewing more and chewing hard stuff can cause you additional problems. So you really should get that checked out if you had TMJ problems before.
Could you spell it?
Phyleme? Yeah, you know what? Hold on one sec. I'm gonna grab it. I'm coming.
Thank you for your generosity.
So this is it. This is
Oh,
Phyleme.
great. Thank you.
You can buy it on Amazon. That's it. You can see I can't even bend this stuff. It's and it gives you a very powerful jaw workout. And as you saw from youth was decades ago for me, but even as a middle-aged adult, you can significantly affect your airway health. And I show that in myself, but again, that's just an N1 study I did for myself, but the science is very, very clear on this. Just like any other muscle, the less you use it, the more out of shape it's going to get. So Phyleme is one way to do that. Also eat harder foods. Don't eat processed stuff. Eat real carrots. Don't make a smoothie out of everything. We're designed to be chewing. That's what all of our ancestors did.
Thank you. People also found in your presentation the video clip of the word inhale and exhale at the tempo that you were providing to be very helpful. Is that a video that is you can cite and people can use for their own practice?
Yes, I have on my website, I listed Dr. Richard Brown's on there, researchers at Johns Hopkins are on there with various breathing techniques. So you can go to mrjamesnestor.com/breath. We'll take you directly to that portal. Not only that, but I do expert interviews with the head of pediatrics at Harvard. He's talking about infant breathing. If you're concerned about infant breathing, he has this whole half-an-hour session on proper breathing for infants. Dr. Stephen Park is on there as well. So those are all free. They're available to everyone. And I know that a lot of these claims seem absolutely outrageous and impossible to believe, which is why I included all of the references to the book are available for free on my website as well. There's about 500 studies there. There's x-rays, there's videos, there's audio, there's other names, and all of the studies that I had mentioned are available there as well.
So what I'd like to do now is just in my own singular voice, share the gratitude that has come through in the Q&A and in the chat, and we all come together as a community to thank you for your generous and wise gift of breath. Be well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.